Buongiorno.
Good morning. Let's start today's session,
In questa prima parte
which will be about the use of non-monetary currencies, alternative currencies in other words. As in the other days, after the two first presentations will be a coffee break, and we will reconvene here with, last but not least, two presenters of the morning session. And finally, there will be a Q&A session. First and foremost, I pass the floor to Alexandra Sapoznik, King's College, Londra, and Lluís Sales Favà from Lisbon University. They will be speaking of wax, cash, and the mass, making candles affordable in late medieval economies.
Thank you. Okay, great. By the later Middle Ages, wax had become an indispensable element in Latin Christian religious observance. By the 14th century, numerous wax candles burned on and above the altars, before the cross, the baptismal font, in front of images and relics, in shrines and tombs in every church in Europe. Vast numbers of wax candles were used during ordinary and extraordinary processions inside churches and on the streets, and most impressively for the Paschal candle, which could weigh 100 kilos or more. Wax candles were also used for every life cycle event: baptism, marriage, churching, illness, and death. Let's see if this works. Yes. This is, so we have a nice picture to look at for a moment while I speak. This is wax being collected from the hives for the Paschal candle. Wax was so ubiquitous in the liturgy that it fueled the internal economy of religious institutions. This paper will analyze the use, reuse, and barter of wax in circular economies within cathedrals, monasteries, and professional guilds. I'll begin by examining the well-elucidated organization within English institutions, which will provide the context for Lluís's detailed case study of the Confraternity of Orsa Michele in Florence, one of the best attested to examples of the circulation of wax within religious institutions, and shedding light on what must have been widespread practice across Europe. Because wax was so expensive and so very, very necessary, its provisioning is usually explained at length in institutional accounts. Yes, okay. No, yes, okay. In larger institutions, the sacrist was responsible for supplying the majority of wax and candles throughout the year. Institutions associated with important saints' cults also had obedentiaries known as freritors, or shrine keepers, who were responsible for the supply and maintenance of candles specifically for the shrine. At some institutions, such as Christ Church, Canterbury, which housed the shrine to St. Thomas Becket, the most famous and well-provisioned shrine in medieval England, the wax needed was so great that the sacrists acquired the wax for their office through the larger purchases of the freritor. And these offices also paid out candles as stipends to other offices. At Bury St. Edmunds in Suffolk in eastern England, the sacrist provided the treasurer with just over 6 kilos of candles every week, plus additional candles as necessary. And the treasurer, in turn, paid these out to the relevant brothers according to their status. At Bury, it was specified that the candle given to the sacrist to the prior at Candlemas should be offered only if the prior was actually present at the abbey. Otherwise, it could be offered in absentia, but then it should be recorded as a grace instead of a custom in case it became enshrined that he needed to make that payment. And later additions to the customary stipulate the size of the candle to be supplied to the prior, 35.5 centimeters, and not too thin. And this candle was part of the generous stipend allowed to the prior, from which he was not parted even in death. At Christ Church, Canterbury, the 25 kilos of wax recovered from the room of Thomas Goldston when he died in 1468 were used for his burial and month's memorial mass. This careful accountancy of wax continued throughout the offices and among the communities of religious institutions. At Canterbury, the shrine keepers supplied 2 torches for the high altar, usually the purview of the sacrist, each 2.5 meters tall and weighing 4.5 kilos, to be renewed 3 times a year to maintain their size. Anyone who broke one had to pay for its repair out of his food allowance in the refectory. And the shrine keepers also had to provide the candles for masses said in the misericord, where the brethren stayed to take a break from the strict Benedictine diet, so basically a room where they were allowed to eat lots of meat. Unless the sacrist was there, in which case he provided the candles from his account. Obviously, maintaining supplies of wax in all of the many, many places candles were needed was a significant aspect of institutional accountancy. And we can see that here in the attention paid to the division of responsibilities regarding wax provision and the regulations around its supply, which extended also to the receipt of used wax and burnt candle ends. At St. Paul's in London, a dispute arose over whether the burning candles and wax ends offered at a particularly popular image of Mary belonged to the dean and canon's resident or to the Bishop of London. And candle provision for funerals was one of the most popular bequests of late medieval wills. It's unsurprising, given the religious and demographic trends of the later 14th and 15th centuries, that candles for funerals and obits were the sources of considerable potential income, and consequently of argument over which church got to keep the candles from the parishioners' funerals. All of which demonstrates the importance and value of recycled candle wax. And this reuse of old wax was common across all types of religious foundation. So the Frariders from the shrine to St. Ethelreda in Ely Cathedral made separate entries for incomes from wax and money. In 1421, the shrine keeper sold 64 pounds, 29 kilos, of wax to pilgrims for 21 shillings 4 at a rate of 4 pennies per pound. The following year, they sold 174 pounds, or 79 kilos, again at 4 pennies per pound. And given that the cathedral bought wax at a rate of just under 3.5 pennies per pound, including transport and manufacture of the candles that year, the cathedral was making just over half a penny per pound of wax, which would have accounted for about 8 shillings for the total amount of wax that was sold. So in the grand scheme of institutional cathedral accountancy, not an enormous money-making activity. But wait. As we've seen, wax candles were rarely burnt all the way down to the end. That the cathedral was reforming old wax into new candles is indicated from further entries in the Frariders' accounts, in which only the cost of manufacture is listed, usually at 1.5 to 2 pennies per pound. If the cathedral was in fact selling a proportion of the wax more than once, then the profit margins may have been substantial indeed. Moreover, shrines also attracted large numbers of wax votives and candles brought from outside the cathedral precincts, which could be put back into circulation within the wax economy, while the presence of priests overseeing these shrines also likely induced particular generosity. Additionally, land rents could also be paid in wax. But however the wax entered into the institutions, it became part of a circular economy to be made, burned, reformed, and burned again, circulating constantly through different hands and offices. The care and attention given to the maintenance of wax, the provision of precisely weighed candles, the collection of melted wax and burnt ends, all demonstrate the ways in which wax became a meaningful medium of exchange within religious institutions, and via rents in kind and pious bequests, entwined the laity into these internal networks of exchange. The accounts from England are rich sources for understanding the institutional context of this circular economy, but they rarely provide the serial information necessary to understand the circuits of consumption and use in their entirety. But in contrast to this, the accounts from Orsanmichele and Florence offer unparalleled insight into this common practice. And so, over to Lluís.
Thank you, Alex. Well, yeah, actually, this part of the paper analyzes, or pretends to analyze, the accounting system of the confraternity of Orsanmichele in Florence in which cash was in some places, in some moments, substituted by the flow of wax, as you'll see. The focus here is placed upon the 1350s and the 1360s, from which a set of books specifically dedicated to wax are under scrutiny of the are under custody, of the Archivio di Stato of Florence. By the early 14th century, I'll show you some nice images as well. To the micro, okay, sorry. By the early 14th century, the confraternity of San Michele had become the main distributor of alms to the poor in Florence, and its depicted Madonna, one you can see here, had such a popular cult that fostered massive offerings of votive wax. But most of this wax was directly supplied on-site by the confraternity itself. In this respect, accounts corresponding to the candles that were sold in the oratory of San Michele have been preserved for the period September 1352, December 1365, so around 14 years. They provide 1,400 different entries that indicate the reception of bundles, so-called mazzi, by San Michele, which probably contained 80 slim candles of approximately, we have calculated, 4 grams each, so really thin, small candles. The candles were acquired by the main officers of the confraternity from the chandlers in the city and were afterwards handed to the individual in charge of selling them. Worshippers left their coins assigned inside an alms box, grabbed a few candles, 1, 2, 3 perhaps, and lit them before the sacred images. During the 14 years that ran between 1352 and 1365, at least 32 different apothecaries were involved in the candle supply to the confraternity. Most of these provided less than the equivalent of 200 kilograms of wax in small candles to be lit in the oratory in front of the Madonna. We generally only trace them in one given year. But 9 individuals, which are the ones you're seeing on the table now, were much more proactive in their relation with the institution. They were responsible for furnishing each 400 kilograms of wax or more. For instance, in the first column, you're seeing Juan Giorgio da Michele, and in the second column, you're seeing Bernardo Salvini, which are documented all through this time span, except for 1364 and 1365, during which the ledgers do not provide the name of the apothecaries that had provided the candles. They brought 6,600 and 5,700 kilograms of candles to the institutions, respectively. Only in 1358, da Michele had manufactured a total of 1,700 kilograms that were sent to the capitani, to the leaders of the confraternity. In total, the impressive quantity of 42 tons of candles could have been sold in their stand during those 14 years, which would equal a volume of 43.7 cubic meters. In the years that are documented, a gross revenue of 61,000 lire was obtained by the confraternity. For comparison purposes, this would have paid off all the daily wages of 24 skilled laborers during those 14 years. The average amount sold per year during the period was of 3,000 kilograms, with a peak by the late 1350s and perhaps a declining tendency that we can observe by 1360 onwards. These are very important quantities, as you see, that indicate the success of this oratory in the city and the region, actually. The confraternity's strategy in wax was thus fueling the local economy, namely the dealers in the product, but also the painters, many of the candles, not all, but many of the candles were decorated, string makers, cotton dealers, from which the wicks were made of, and even porters. Most of this wax was sold in the form of small candles, as I've said, approximately 4 grams each. Given that some 42 tons of wax were sold here, this implies that more than 10 million candles were lit in front of the image of the Madonna during those 14 years. The candle seller was supposed to transfer the money obtained from the sales of the candles as soon as possible, but this was sometimes not so swiftly accomplished. Just as an example of many others, on November 9th of 1352, the sale of 440 bulks of candles yielded 220 lire, of which 155 were given to the institution, the treasurer, in less than 2 weeks. But the remaining 65 lire, or perhaps the candles themselves, we're not absolutely sure, were kept by the salesman as his own salary. Once in their hands, the parishioners would light these thin candles in front of the image of the Madonna. But the parishioners carried other wax objects with them. Votive images, larger and fancier candles as well, which could have been purchased from chandlers and apothecaries, or from external stands that we know existed just in the square up front, the Loggia del Grano. Well, two different extant ledgers include the accounts for the oblations left in wax, and perhaps also the one that had only partially been burned in front of the tabernacle of the Madonna. This was all known as the Tratta di Cera. The accounts correspond to the period April 1360, in this case, to February 1366, providing 400 entries with a total volume of wax of 9,500 kilograms, distributed as shown in the slide. All this wax, a valuable material, was explicitly collected by command of the treasurer of the confraternity. To take advantage of the wax, has to be noted, of the wax left behind, was a common practice, I would say in the city, but all over the Western Christian Mediterranean. The accounts indicate that the treasurer issued a relatively small amount of candles and wax for different liturgical acts that took place both inside and outside the oratory. For example, the set of candles, weighing on average 8 kilograms each time, that were taken to many different churches of the city, just to mention some, Santo Spirito, San Romolo, Santa Croce, but many others, as much as 30 actually, to celebrate in all these churches the masses of the capitans of San Michele. With the shipment of medium-sized candles, the confraternity was actively contributing to the scattering of wax throughout the city. In its turn, once it was partially burned, those candles were collected by the services of the respective temples. Similar candles were also used on site in San Michele. They were lit during the laude that were sung in the vigils of different patron saints' days at the oratory, while larger cerotti of approximately 340 grams each, or the thicker giunte, which got to 800 grams each, were placed on chandeliers or torches by a body of officers. Still in that same occasion, the smallest candles were given a mano to the worshippers. Taking into account the high cost of wax in the Florentine market, as everywhere actually, the splendid illumination in candles of these routinized acts appear as grandiloquent. It certainly contributed to the reputation of our San Michele in the city. Still, most wax that had been recovered in the oratory or offered as oblations was sent back to the apothecaries. These would render them into the initial candele minute we've seen, exclusively charging the manufacturing costs, but not the material itself, since it was the confraternity who had provided it. Between 1364 and 1366, 5,350 kilograms of wax were sent to the apothecaries, who returned in exchange 5,236 kilograms of candles, with a slight difference that we think are due to the spills of wax during the rendering process. Between 1364 and 1366, 6 different apothecaries of Florence received wax regularly. They mostly took moccoli and torches that had entered the circuit through bequests, but also white wax and images of other origins. The melting and the manufacturing of each type needed different skills. Cera Nuova was the easiest to melt and remodel. In consequence, its manufacturing costs were cheaper. But processing the predominant smeared moccoli was a bit more expensive. At the end, the production of candles made with 5,236 kilograms of wax during those 2 years had a cost of 1,050 lire. These chandlers produced the candles, and to come full circle again, these were sent back to the confraternity who would sell them. From this, the system put in motion by your San Michele was yielding profit margins of 85% in the middle of the 14th century. But this was at the height of the fame. The oratory of San Michele and its managers ran a complex system that combined wax recycling and candle production, and that raised important revenues, as we've seen. This system meant cash was only required for manufacturing the candles, while probably all the rest, meaning the salaries, the material itself, probably even the new candles needed for the liturgy inside the temple, was bartered for wax. And now off to my conclusions, to our conclusions actually. Given the value of wax in the Western European markets of the late Middle Ages, the officers in charge of supplying it both to ecclesiastical and lay institutions were very careful in the accounting. The inputs and outputs of the material even deserved specific clearances of accounts, and we have some nice examples of that. The reuse of beeswax was a common practice, since this material easily allows for the remelting and the reshaping. Hence, both for England and for Italy, and we can have put other examples of other regions we have studied, we have evidenced how the institutions did not only yield profits from the sales of candles, but also from the collection of the remaining stubs that themselves had previously sold to the parishioners. These and other practices, such as the entries of wax in rents, as Alex has mentioned, or gifts between institutions in the form of wax, lower the prices of the wax offered by the institutions, allowing its use for all strata of society. This, what we've come to call the moral economy of wax, was only possible in the case of the larger institutions, which were capable of cutting expenses in such ways. The desire to display wealth through wax candles had a further important consequence, because it meant that there was always used candles of various sizes for sale. This made wax affordable and accessible for both urban and rural poor. And for those who could not afford even this, it was a well-known act of charity to provide wax candles for the most impoverished. While the circular economy of wax allowed even the poorest to participate in these celebrations of civic and religious nature. Thank you.
Mille grazie Alexandra e Lluís.
Thank you, Alexandra Sapoznik and Lluís, for this very important presentation. The next presentation will by Team Soens and Cécile Bruyet from Antwerp University, Farm to Spoon, in-kind food deliveries by tenant farmers in the late medieval cities. Sarò io a parlare perché la mia coautrice non è potuta intervenire.
She will elaborate this.
Spero che si senta la traduzione.
Let me take you to the city of Antwerp on the 24th of January 1438. And that day, a tenant farmer, Jan Brouw, of a farm in Contig, 10 kilometers south of the city, had his lease contract registered by the Antwerp alderman. The owner was one Walter Pot, who was given this farm as a wedding gift by his father, Pieter Pot, a rich merchant coming from Dordrecht, having made fortune in Antwerp, and which I imagine looked a bit like this Joos Feit on the Ghent altarpiece by Van Eyck. And the farm was leased out for a substantial amount of £6 groten Brabants, the equivalent of 140 days' work of a master carpenter at the time, but also for important deliveries in grain. 5,200 liters of rye, 4,300 of oats, which are really treated as alternative currency in this lease contract. Next to that, the tenant farmer also had to deliver to the wife of the owner small quantities of flax, 1 stone, that's a few kilo of butter, 1 fat lamb, and 100 eggs. And I think this is more in a sort of gift-giving economy between tenant farmer and owner. Apart from that, the tenant farmer also agreed to perform 6 one-day labor services per year, and we can discuss whether these can be labeled also alternative currencies. So, Walter Pot was not the only rich urban citizens who owned farms or land in the countryside. And in the historiography, this urban intrusion in the rural world has been primarily seen as capital investment and a vector of social mobility for rich urban citizens. It was coined la trahison de la bourgeoisie by Fernand Braudel, the treason of the burghers. But part of the urban land might also have originated from migrations, because cities relied on a constant influx of rural migrants. Some were poor, but others might have inherited at least some land from their parents and families, at least in regions of portable inheritance like this region. And as the example of Waterpot illustrates, all these configurations of urban-based land ownership also brought with them a possibility, a claim, an entitlement perhaps, if we use Amartya Sen's term, to have food delivered directly to the urban households, either on a structural base or only in times of food shocks, food crisis. These alternative food flows have long been ignored as irrelevant, archaic relics of the past, of the natural economy of the past. But in contexts where most food went via the market, enjoying some form of alternative access to food, which was not monetarized, might have been even more important. And there might have been different reasons, and that's what I want to investigate in this paper. Was it about social status? Was it about food security? Or was it even to wield a sort of market power on the grain market? And of course, such analysis is particularly relevant for the later Middle Ages. The later Middle Ages, where the theoretical balance between population and food supplies was structurally altered after the Black Death, the price for basic foodstuffs did decline, although only from 1370 onwards, but at the same time, also after the Black Death, there still were violent price shocks, violent periods of food shortage and famine in the 15th century. Food consumption itself also did not remain unaltered. There was an increased consumption of meat and dairy and fish, although not for everyone, but it did increase. In towns, the food provisioning remained profoundly market-based, with a surprising variety of bakers, butchers, fishmongers, brewers, all competing for customers in what James Davis has called a pragmatic moral economy. There is the moral economy again. Buyers and sellers knew and trusted one another, and profit-making was expected to remain within certain limits. There was also place for long-distance food trades in the 15th century, which reconfigured rather than collapse after the Black Death. And we see the long-distance trade in herring, in wine along the Rhine, the trade in hop beers were all expanding. And by the end of the 15th century, the Baltic grain trade to the southern North Sea area also took off. In this context, what did these direct deliveries from tenant farmers to urban households really mean? And what I want to do in the rest of my paper is contrast the diverging experience of two cities at the top of the urban hierarchy in the southern Low Countries, but with opposite demographic trends. On the one hand, we have Ghent. Ghent was the largest city of the Low Countries, 60,000 inhabitants before the Black Death, slightly declining to 50,000 in the 15th century. It was a textile center, and for its grain provisioning, it relied on the river trade via Scheldt and Leie rivers, which brought grain from what is today the north of France. And on this grain trade, the city had developed its grain staple, as it's called, which made sure that all cereals transported via these rivers had first to be offered for sale in Ghent. Antwerp was still much smaller than Ghent, but the city was atypical because it continued to expand after the Black Death from about 10,000, 12,000 inhabitants to 30,000 and more at the end of the 15th century, with an economy concentrating on trade and shipping rather than textiles. In the hinterland of both cities, we have three major agricultural regions, and the best known is the region south of Antwerp and Ghent, which is the birthplace of the so-called Flemish or Dutch husbandry, this smallholding farming system with owner-occupied peasant smallholdings, and a few larger tenant farms per village, which were often owned by urban landlords. By the 16th century, this inland Flanders region was a net importer of food in times of meager harvests. Compared to inland Flanders, the coastal marshes of the North Sea, they evolved in a completely different directions. They remained net exporters of cereals and cattle, but here a very competitive market for land came into existence, and we see scale enlargement of farms throughout the 15th century. It can be labeled a region where agrarian capitalism set off. East of Antwerp, we have then a third agricultural system, this Campine area. This is a sort of peasant agriculture, but with extensive common heathlands, where peasants relied on income from these common heathlands as well. Now, for both Ghent and Antwerp, we know that urban households owned a lot of land in the countryside. And not only the elite, also middle classes, the upper part of the craft guilds, the masters, the better off masters of the craft guilds also owned land, often not massive amounts of land, but they had some hectares, 3, 4, 5 hectares of land they often owned. Now, I skip this and I go to the leasehold contracts. In both Ghent and Antwerp, transactions involving real estate were often registered by the urban aldermen rather than notaries, and the lease contracts are a very rich source of information. In Antwerp, there are, on average, in the 15th century, 70 lease contracts per year, which gives a rather good corpus. We sampled this for the 1430s and 1490s. The geography of the leases, it mirrors the range of the land ownership, which for Ghent, of course, it's much larger. It's the largest city. It goes to 40, 50 kilometers south of the city. For Antwerp, it's more situated in the traditional, what we could call hinterland of the city. Now, did they rely on in-kind supplies? There are clear differences between both cities. In Antwerp, about half of the lease contracts in the 15th century stipulated deliveries in kind. In Ghent, this was only 1/3, clearly less. What these in-kind payments mean, it could be very different. On the one hand, we have the contracts with an extensive range of products to be delivered by the tenant farmer to the landlord, as in the example of Waterpot at the beginning of my presentation. But in other contracts, by far the largest part of the lease was paid in cash, and some products were delivered in kind. It could be a contribution to the energy provisioning of the urban household, some peat, some wood. It could also be wax, which is also present in some of the lease contracts, some eggs, some flax also, but small quantities. And in others, we have this full range of products with an important role for cereals also. Now, what we wanted to know is whether there were any patterns in the preference for cash or kind. And in order to do so, we concentrated on 5 variables: the city, the decade, the 1430s or the 1490s, the social profile of the owner, the type of property, is it a farm or is it a plot of land, and also the region in which the property was situated, these 3 agricultural regions of the southern Low Countries. Now, what we did was a statistical analysis, not the analysis of variance in the preliminary paper, which was not very good, but an odds ratio calculated through a binary logistic regression, which gives better results. And it clearly shows that the city mattered, that the type of property mattered, and that the region mattered. They were all very significant in the statistical analysis. Leases in Antwerp more frequently involved in-kind payments. The same is true for farms compared to simple plots of land, and to location, to the region where the property was situated, with a polder area less likely to be subject to in-kind deliveries compared to inland Flanders, notably. There is no difference between the 1430s and the 1490s. These differences become even more visible when concentrating on the deliveries of cereals. And there we see that in Ghent, Private households almost never ask for cereals. Only 8 out of 187 contracts we find cereals. Only ecclesiastical institutions did so in Ghent. In Antwerp, this was clearly not the case. In the 1430s, we see half of the urban owners, private households, asking for cereals, in-kind payments in cereals. And the quantities, they were rather standardized. This is the contracts with cereals as lease. And in blue, we see the institutions. The others are the natural persons. And in Antwerp, we see that the range is the median is about 2,000 to 4,000 liters, combination of rye and oats mostly. And I think this is about what a larger household in the city needed on an annual basis, which makes us think that this has really a role in the provisioning of these households. In Ghent, for private households, if they ask cereals, it's nothing, in fact. It's a few hundred liters. It's very small quantities. Who were these people asking for cereals? We delved into the social profile of the owners, and then we see that members of the political elite, the aldermen of the city, the urban nobility also, they were much more likely to demand in-kind and to demand cereals than the craftsmen who owned land. So the craftsmen, there are not that many of them, but if we see them as owner of rural property, they only ask for cash. We have a butcher, a carpenter, a shoemaker, we even have a gardener, and if they leased out land or farms, they asked for cash, basically, not for cereals or in-kind products. A word on geography. The distance made a difference? It did not. It completely did not. There was no von Thünen-like effect on food provisioning, not at all. We see hospitals which had a farm very close to the city asking for cash, and another farm at 40 kilometers distance asking for leases in kind, which is interesting. These products then had to be delivered via rivers mostly. There were a lot of rivers, but still a geographic distance of 40 kilometers is easily the double if you go by rivers, so it's 80 kilometers away. It's quite an effort to bring in these products from a tenant farm to the city. Also interesting, in the polder areas, the coastal areas, this area of nascent agrarian capitalism along the North Sea coasts, leases were only in cash. There were no in-kind deliveries, had nothing to do with distance. In Antwerp, the polder area is immediately in the north of the city. It's only cash. And on the one hand, we thought this might have something to do with the larger importance of animal farming in the polders. Because leases in cattle did not exist, so cattle was never part of in-kind deliveries. But it might also have to do with a higher degree of commercialization on the land markets. This was the only region where leasehold was the dominant form of tenure, and on the competitive land markets, leases were always expressed, standardized in cash per surface unit of land. So very competitive land market, leases in cash per area of land, where there was apparently no place for in-kind deliveries and alternative currencies left. Finally, we wanted to assess the importance of cereals as alternative currency in the cereal economy of these cities. This is only for Antwerp, because in Ghent there was no place for cereals as alternative currencies. Ghent had its grain staple, which probably had about the same effect, a sort of additional access to the grain market, a more secure access to the grain market. But in Antwerp, it was substantial. So these lease contracts in the 1430s, they demanded the supply of 43,000 liters of bread cereals per year. The average duration of a lease was 9.4 years, and as a result, the total amount of bread cereals which entered the city via this way can be assessed at 412,000 liters, enough to feed 1,100 adults throughout the year. By the 1490, this volume had increased to about the double, and feeding 2,100 adults. And as a result, we can conclude that 5 to 10% of the Antwerp of the cereal market was not monetarized, in fact. And this is even an underestimation, because not all leaseholds were registered. Because we omitted also the few sharecropping contracts which did exist. We also omitted the leases of tithes and mills, also often in kind, and the lease contracts which were not registered by the Antwerp aldermen. Moreover, there were a lot of annuities and customary rents in kind. And taking all this together, we might easily conclude that 25 to 30% of the urban cereal supplies was never converted to money. Why did urban households in one of the most commercialized regions of the 15th century stuck to direct deliveries of cereals? For the urban elite, there are some account books, not many, but a few, dating from the 1450s, 50s, 40s, 60s, like this one studied by Mark Bone from Simon Borluut in Ghent. Borluut, a member of a rich patrician family, his account books reveal a lot on both his relationships with tenant farmers, which were very personal. He presented them, for instance, with wedding gifts for their children, and also on his food provisioning strategies. And at first sight, Borluut did not make use of direct supplies. We see him buying a lot of foodstuffs: cattle, pigs, beer, dry herrings, bread, pies, etc. He made ample use of these trusted suppliers. In his ricordance, one might say, the pastry cook was his pastry cook, his pastei de bakker. The brewer, which was a female brewer, was his brewsterige, his brewster. And not because it was his own servant, because it was a trusted supplier somewhere in the city. The payment was done once every year. However, he never paid for 3 products: poultry, fresh fish, and cereals. And these probably were delivered to him by his tenants or from rents in kind paid to him. And why did he do so? One of the reasons why urban households clung on this direct provisioning of grain must, of course, have been food security and the fundamental importance of cereals in times of food shortage. When the prices were skyrocketing, a lease in kind became highly advantageous for an urban landlord, as it became disastrous also for the tenant farmer, who faced a poor harvest and missed the opportunity to sell his grain for a high price. During the food crisis of 1481-83, un pur trauma de froidure et de pluie, catastrophe of cold and rain, as Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie has labeled it. It was one of the worst subsistence crises of the century. And the Antwerp aldermen, followed by the government of Brabant, were fully aware of the importance of these cereal supplies, these direct supplies of cereals to the city. And they intervened to force the tenant farmers to first settle their leases and their rents in kind before being allowed to sell anything on the market. So what we see there is that the corn laws, as we could call it, of the 1480s made clear that the cereal rents always had precedence over sales, providing landlords with a powerful argument to maintain and expand their rents in kind. So I come to my conclusion. In the heart of the urban Low Countries, land-based food supplies clearly remained important throughout the medieval period, though not everywhere and not for everyone. For Antwerp, we estimated that a quarter to a third of the grain supplies escaped monetarization. They were not converted into cash. In Ghent, this was almost nothing. And as we said, as we hypothesized, this might have been to do with this grain staple, which had about the same effect and which made this kind of private insurance mechanisms redundant. Now, when explaining the preference for cash or kind, there are several variables which come into play. Some of them relate to the urban society and economy, others to the rural world. At the urban side of the equation, urban population size seems not decisive. Rents in kind were not simply converted to cash as cities grew. Antwerp is an example of a city which is really growing in the 15th century, but so did the importance of cereals as alternative currency. Trends in food consumption were also not very important. Meat clearly gained in importance, but meat is the one product which is cash only. Meat is never used as alternative currency. Social status clearly played a role. In part, this is about what we can call food sovereignty. Eating bread from one's own grain remained important for the upper part of the urban population in the 15th century. Even in Ghent, some institutions, some families kept on doing so, as the Borluut family showed. Social status, and on the other hand, food security. In times of famine, you see that these leases in kind gave urban landlords a preferential claim on highly valuable cereals, and the Antwerp legislation in the 1480s clearly demonstrates the importance of these grain flows. Even those landlords from the middle groups who asked for cash payments might have enjoyed a more direct access to grain in times of food shortage, thanks to their land ownership in the countryside. Perhaps the cash leases were sometimes converted to lease, which was important for them. But it's not only about the urban economy, it's also about the rural economy, as the prevalence of cash leases in the coastal polder area versus more in-kind supplies from the two other agricultural regions demonstrates. And here we think that payments in kind, alternative currencies were compatible with commercialization, but they seem less compatible with a sort of commodification of the land market. This highly competitive lease market in the coastal polder areas did not allow for the use of alternative currencies anymore. So there was no resistance against monetarization, not at all. But in a world where everything was monetarized, sometimes using alternative currencies might have been advantageous. This was especially true for cereals, the one product where the monetarization has led to a sort of unpredictable, highly volatile market with the price setting beyond human control. There was not a single city who could really control the price of grain in the 15th century. And there, using cereals as currency was a very attractive insurance mechanism, and also one which clearly showed the status of the owner. Cash, in the end, was something, sorry, I didn't skip it. Cash, in the end, was something for the urban poor and for poor leaseholders, which were only allowed to pay in cash. Thank you very much.
Mille grazie anche a Tim.
Thank you, Tim. And as we said already, we can take our first break now. Coffee break, 20 minutes, and we will reconvene here in 20 minutes. Thank you.
Cominciamo.
Okay, right, we go back to our proceedings now right away. So first and foremost, Claustre from Paris University on clothing and manufacturing as an alternative currency. I want to tell you 2 questions. Question will be placed at the end, will be asked at the end of the presentation. So you have to pick up this form, to fill in this form in order to ask a question to the 4 presenters this morning. Thank you. Julie. Good morning. Good morning, anyone. I would like to propose now some arguments about clothing as alternative currency. So I just I've been focusing on a dressmaker, a couturier, working in Paris between 1420 and 1455, in the first half of the 15th century, in Rive Gauche, in the eastern part of Rive Gauche in Paris. What I'm proposing now is a monographic analysis of payments in kind that have been made in this boutique, in this dressmaker's workshop. That's a monographic analysis which is necessary for understanding dressmakers, and also have documents being good in order to examine many interpretation ways as to the real way these dressmakers was paid. I'm going to see some points, in-kind payments, and also needs of clients with specific economic background, commercial and monetary. I get started with some quick presentation on sources, the ledger of this dressmaker, to see the in-kind payments that were taken by the dressmaker, and later on the in-kind payments work done by this dressmaker, by this couturier, and finally I will give you the general understanding of all that. Well, this ledger makes it possible to make this. That's the only ledger of a Paris man of the Middle Age. Mages that has been kept, even though we know the workshop ledgers were quite common in the 14th century in Paris. So these are clothes in a book published in 1455. So they mention clothing. So because this ledger has been reused after Conan de Leroy passed away, after his death, in order to reprint another book, and this entailed the destruction of many pages of the initial book. What is now kept in the French case are the remnants of 32 sheets where we have the complete text of 191 notes. Well, later on, now you see, later on you see other probes. Now you see the memorandum for needs, invoices issued, and also the payments of the rent, of the lease, and then documents also tracing the financial relationship between this dressmaker and his trade partners, the accounts, and also a full list of the debts. These are full lists, these are full documents about the owners, the clients, and also a small amount of subcontractors of these dressmakers. So starting from this document, I try to go back to the payments in kind. No surprise, all transactions that were just written down in this document, all these transactions were paid in cash, were settled in cash. These sheets also show the payments in kind made by the clients. And now you see the names of these clients. And if you look at the invoice of Conan de Leroy, So we have the clothes, or the dresses, or the jackets. So invoices show some payments in kind, and also some payments in kind. Receipts, reçus, with different graphical variants, but also we have to also consider these description of payments are not systematic. These correspond, I can show you now, right away. These are, however, showing payments, partial payments, and not complete payments, and not the entire payments that Colin de Roy got. Starting from this, we also try to see which is the part which is played by payments in kind totally. So from these documents, you see payments in kind, 119 payments in kind. Among these 119 payments in kind, so we have a lot of clients. So this was 1/6 of the entire payments, so payments in kind. So we have this. This is a not neglectable rate, payments in kind. Which kind of these payments in kind? Paying for, trousers and jackets. Payments in kind, they said, foodstuff, grains, barley, and also some fat, grease. And then we go to payments in cereals and grains that has been previously reported. The dressmaker was given huge quantities of cereals or grains, not neglectable. So we have grain, cereals, 120 kilograms being reported, and that's the necessary grains needed to a household for many months in a row. We try to compare the prices. We try to compare the prices also these cereals in the invoices. Compare the cereals charted with the prices, the market prices at the same time in Paris. Now we see the prices also in the Collège de Buret. We can compare these prices with the price mentioned in the archives of the Paris Cathedral. And also we have a diary of a logbook of bourgeois in Paris who was a member of the cathedral, of the cathedral. What I want to show you in this document, I'm going to share you, well, this is a comparison. You see the dressmaker was getting cereals, grains, or barley or oats, getting low-cost cereals, grains. That's what the dressmaker is receiving. So the payment in 1431, this was a payment in nature, grains, very hard here in Paris. After the military embargo of the city, the seizure of the city in Notre Dame de Paris, in the main cathedral, so they bought something and also received something in kind. And also they had to guarantee the procurements of the cathedral in order to feed the institutions ruling Paris. The price increases are important these years, and Colin de Roy, when gets cereals and wheat and grains, 19.4 sous. So you see prices in Paris are above the 40 sous. So this is a quite high price, which makes it possible just to get some cereals, grains, 3 times less expensive versus the current trade or market price of cereals or grains in Paris those times. Well, to go ahead, in this survey, we can see 2 different types of clashing situations, thanks to which Colin de Roy gets cereals or grains. This is sheet 168, which is a recap of all these transactions. So we have an invoice that has been issued for the dioceses, settling one part of these invoice with grain cereals, which is testing some huge price differences. The Beauvais College reduced. Now you see the prices of the Beauvais College are almost 21 sous. 2, whereas the other quotations in Paris, so the quotations speak of 10 instead of 20. So Colin de Lormeau buys by this huge quantity of grains, but in spite of all that, the price difference is the price gap is quite small. What's interesting and very appealing is to understand this element, which is shown in the invoice. This is a monk of the cathedral having the office of controller of the cathedral, so having some managerial functions in order to manage the lands of the cathedral over many years of time, and this was quite good, upgrading him to find the cereal traders and farmers, and also to allow the dressmaker to get the favorable prices. And in 1168, this is showing that the price has been fixed, has been settled down after consulting some specialists, people who knew the foodstuff, the commodities. So the clerk is financing one part of the clothing buying from the dressmaker. So we had Cyril took all necessary measures in order to set up a cereal price not being too high. And second type of situation that I wanted to stress quickly now, so that's the sheet 3072. Lübeck, who was an aristocrat in a very important place in order, is quite important for his family, his household, and also we know, thanks to the invoices delivered by these, issued by these dressmakers, he had some lands, and also farmer tenants taking care of managing these lands. And this aristocrat was always late in paying. He was also lended some money, he borrowed some money, and he was in a quite awkward situation as to the clothes supply. So Lebeau paid many times, so paying out these invoices of just in cereals. And these prices, the price of cereals being shown, these prices are more favorable, 5 times lower in 38 and also and later on. So according to the current market prices, another foodstuff or another commodity which shows up again, I didn't mention for reasons of time, so another type of foodstuff, I said. Another important element is given by candles. So candles, as we said, wax ends. So these candles are quite necessary to allow the dressmaker to keep on working. These candles, wax candle, are just given to the dressmaker by another client, the priest of the Saint-Severin Church in the parish where the dressmaker has his shop, his workshop. Everything is detailed in documents. So we have this priest making important orders, and in return he gets some partial payment in candles of different sizes from a priest who had a lot of candles to give in payment, and these candles are going to be indispensable. He also was given an entire garden and also some butter from another client. I didn't get time to give you further detail. What I want to tell you earlier on, so these in-kind payments received by the dressmaker, they're showing a distinctive behavior of the dressmaker. That's strategic. That's a real strategy in order to get a payment in nature, in cereals, in grains, etc. At the time, there was some, galloping inflation of cereals price. So the way he gets candles and also lamps necessary for his work. So the payment in kind made by the dressmaker, of course, we speak of payment in work. So as far as he's concerned, payment and work go hand in hand on the occasion of settling. The lease in dresses. And also he pays the butcher with the dress he just made, exchanging the dress versus meat or for stuff, so bartering meat with clothes, dresses, or suits. Now we have one slide now to share. That's the way he pays for services he needs, and also the way he pays the master of his son, Galas. And also we see in other documents very well, these quite well. He got a diploma in 67, and also he got additional education qualification. Collant de leur, almost we have nine sheets, leaflets. So we have these 9 leaflets. And so between 1439 and 43, it guaranteed the schooling success of his son. So if we take a closer look at the information we have available, Jean Boucard is a master having some good knowledge in pedagogy. Is a quite notorious master, Charles VII and Louis XI. So he places an order for his pupils, just placing the order of suits for the masters in his small college. So we have a lot of orders. For impossible just listing these orders of clothes. I just have a few information about this ledger of the workshop. So these invoices are added up to the accounts in the Colin document. What's it about? These are little or small documents, Colin and Jean Boucard. They make, the point of this iteration of their own negotiations and activities, of their exchanges. That's a very detailed account, quite incredible. That's a leaflet. Very descriptive, 111, Colin de leur and the master of his son are mentioned. It's not like this because there were a small financial account where the schoolmaster charges for his teaching more than 20 francs, and also they must be settled. And sometimes more than 12 francs for his teaching. So first and foremost, we have some close understanding on the real costs of teaching of classes and other types of information, and also the timeline of these accounts are interesting. These accounts have very certain dates. Invoices do not have that. So rarely we have dates on the interest makers' invoices. In contrast, dates are shown, are certain. And from these data, we can see one invoice has been issued in June, and that invoice has been issued in February, and also in the month of March. So the impression is that the dressmaker and his son, schoolmaster, have a sort of bookkeeping done twice during the school year. So finally, at the end of the stitching period, semesters, we speak of semesters. So this is a window on the teaching of that period. So we have these precise accounts. So accounts 111. The school costs more than 120 sous. And in contrast, we have one invoice, the total sum of this complete invoice for Jean Boucard, one invoice of 13 items, 158 sous, 118 dresses, and 110 sous or suits. Now you see the final and financial relationship, and also the difference of income between these two characters, these two personnel. You see the prices for dressmaking being invoiced by Colin de leur. This is quite expensive. So price did not change over 35 years. A cape, a coat, at the same price. because now you charge for the work, not for the fabric used for making the suit. And then we have the rate of the workshop, which is a fixed rate for dressmaking. And sometimes you have to imagine que de leur makes 50 coats in order to settle the invoice of 320 sous of the school for his son. And I'm going back to the same interpretation as before. After examining a certain amount of situation, that's a sort of micro-analytical examination of Colin de Lormois. Which are my end conclusions to draw now? The first assumption to interpret this payment in kind are just the result of the will of the actors not to follow the regulation of compulsory prices. But what occurs in Paris, the value or prices is fixed for bread, but not for cereals. The price of cereals is free. Instead, the price of bread is fixed. It is sticky. For dressmaking turns out to be more difficult. We have a tariff, we have a rate for dressmaking, for making the suit and making the dress. So price is very stable, but do not believe we have some rates to pay for the work done. I've no evidence of these about the price of dressmaking in Paris. We have no prices for dressmaking in the first half of the 14th century. The second type of interpretation, maybe these payments in nature are due to the will of avoiding problems, monetary troubles. We got instability, monetary troubles, instability, economy troubles. So on those circumstances, it's likely we have some monetary changes well known, but not very well studied. They are known in Paris and well documented in this period of time, above all in the year 1420 and then 30. The documentation at Paris Cathedral showing the amount of problems, instability and monetary changes. Since 1404 up to 1423, for two Collin's transactions, we have a time coincidence with these monetary problems. But these monetary problems are not shown clearly. They're not in Collin's documents. The account is a constant element of the transaction. Third type of interpretation, we have problems with social structure. So I already have told you the income gap between the dressmaker and some of his clients. For his work, Jean Boucard s'est invoice. Jean Boucard, these are very interesting invoices. Colin de Lormois is going to multiply the work done for Jean Boucard, being a client, a very highly spending client. Once again, that's the way to dress some pupils, teaching masters under the authority of Jean Boucard. But Colin de Lormois accept the relationship with Jean Boucard. That's a very complex relationship. That's a quite a sort of subcontracting. Colin de Lormois is quite incredible. Before Jean Boucard accepts to outsource some operations with other participants. Maybe we have just a woman preparing or cutting some suits. This subcontracting, outsourcing, that's incredible in this book by Colin de Lormois. Finally, we say the dressmaker is obliged to outsource in order to settle the debts. For his son, a teaching class, is obliged to accept some works and to play a role in the textile work organization, which goes beyond the borders of the usual stuff done. Jean Boucard, we say, that accepts to make suits, dresses for the baker and his wife. So you see, that's a closed loop. So these suits are like a currency, and suits are almost used as a sort of currency. and payments in kinds can also show some phenomena of social structure, income gap or difference. And to finish this off, I want to show you some details. We have to take into account something which has been already said yesterday. So we have to see that clothes are a mean of remuneration. Also as a value reserve, also as pounds, gifts, and whatever. And also dresses and suits are used as a gift and also as a legacy or inheritance. Just to sum these up, what we can say that starting from this book and also trying to read this carefully, we can see some elements, very interesting elements. Payment in kind is very important in the life of the 15th century. We have a monetarized economy, of course, but also we have this payment in kind as a way to access foodstuffs or as a way to get commodities, so like candles to burn, and as a way to offset the effect of the money fluctuation, and as a means to pay for very expensive services. And also for reserves, as money reserve, collecte de l'armoire, that's a way to access to some forms of credit. And the payment in clothes or dresses or suits is very important at the social level. To the entire Parisian society, small households, but also large palaces of the aristocrats, of the noble class. Okay, that's it, I mean. These entail some specific changes over many years in Paris. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you a lot for your attention.
Merci beaucoup pour cette très intéressante intervention. Mille grazie.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. We give the floor Comuzzi from Foreign University in New York. He will be telling us about payment in services and in the cloth dyeing industry in the 14th century, Puigcerdà.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. So in my paper,
Nella mia relazione,
and payment and services. Oh, okay. Now? Okay. So in my paper, I looked at payment in kind and payment in services in the Pyrenean town of Puigcerdà in the early 14th century. In this town, during this period, payment in kind appears to have been rare, at least in written records, except in the case of wages, and payment in services was common only in one industry, cloth dyeing. Cloth dyers regularly promised to pay their own debts by dyeing cloth, something virtually unseen in any other industry in this town during this period. The use of payment in services only by the cloth dyers indicates that in this case, payment in services was unrelated to the level of monetization or to the supply of coinage available in this society. Instead, it appears to have resulted from the particular economic circumstances affecting this industry in this moment. During this period, the cloth industry was experiencing rapid expansion, and cloth dyers were importing woad and other dyestuffs, other dyes and alum, from Occitan and Tuscan merchants, whose long-distance trade practices may have preferred the transitive debt payments, repayment forms, that led to the popularity of payment in services in this industry. Indeed, in contrast to a view that payment in services represents an underdeveloped form of exchange, in this case, the use of payment in services appears to derive directly from a stronger connection to the long-distance trade networks that drove the development of increasingly sophisticated commercial and business techniques in the later Middle Ages. So briefly, a little bit of context. So here's a map where you can see where Puigcerdà is. It's in Catalonia. And in this period, the town had a population of around 7,500 to 8,000 people. And economically, the town was increasingly focused on the production of wool cloth for export. The economy was also certainly a money economy, and one which made frequent use of credit. In the hundreds of thousands of surviving notarial acts, the vast majority of transactions are monetized. The values that are owed or paid are typically stated in money, most commonly the coinage of Barcelona. Money, of course, does not necessarily equal coinage. Several aspects seen in the surviving notarial records suggest that the people of medieval Puigcerdà used money in their written transactions to refer to the abstract of a standard value without always expecting or necessarily requiring payment in specie. So basically the question I'm asking here is whether or not we can assume that specie was the expected or required form of payment when a transaction lists a sum in a given value of money. And the evidence of Puigcerdà suggests that the answer to this question is no. Firstly, the money most commonly used in the notarial registers is in fact a ghost money or a money of account. Like many other medieval monies, the coinage of Barcelona was counted in pennies, shillings, and pounds, but of these, only pennies were actually minted. Shillings and pounds are sort of money of account that do not physically exist. Even if we put that problem aside, another facet of these acts suggests that these people were more concerned with value than with the return of a specific coinage. So it's not uncommon to see debts in which the value owed, which is stated in the coinage of Barcelona, is also pegged to another currency, such as the gold morabeton, or to a specific value measured in marks of silver. So I've put an example of that here in the Latin, which you can see. This practice would help protect a creditor against the possible devaluation of the currency while they await repayment. But its use also suggests that the people of medieval Puigcerdà were more concerned with the return of a specific value, which they measured in relation to a fixed quantity of gold or silver, and which coins of a specific type could equal, or for which another currency or perhaps something else might substitute. Even further, the emphasis on the return of a standard value, not necessarily in the form of coin, can be seen in the abundant evidence that debts were often repaid transitively in this society. So a person could satisfy their own debts by transferring to their creditors a debt that they were owed, without the need for coinage to change hands for at least one of the transactions. So these can appear in two different forms, sometimes combined into a single notarial act, sometimes spread across multiple notarial acts where debts are specifically sold or transferred. And I'll go through a few examples. So in one case, a man named Bartomeu was required to pay back his mother's dowry, which they identify as being worth 7 silver marks. But because his father's estate did not have sufficient resources to satisfy this debt, he instead transferred to his mother an outstanding debt of 10 pounds in the money of Barcelona that was owed to him by a cloth dyer named Berenguer, on account of a garden that Bartomeu had sold to Berenguer at some point in the past. So instead of owing Bartomeu for the garden, Berenguer now owed Gaia, the mother. So it goes from this to this. So Bartomeu satisfied his debt to his mother not by paying in coin, but with a debt that had been owed to him. The same debt could theoretically be transferred an infinite number of times, and this particular case illustrates that it was not uncommon for debts to be transferred more than once. Immediately after receiving the transfer of Berenguer's debt, Gaia then sells it on to someone else named Arnau Romeu, and at some later point, Arnau Romeu later ordered it transferred to another Arnau Alas, who finally recovered it from Berenguer. In another example, noted in a single notarial act in this case, a cloth merchant owed money to a man named Pera because he had bought cloth on credit, and Pera owed a fur trader named Guillem because he had bought furs on credit. So instead of the initial cloth merchant, Jaume, owing Pera, and Pera owing Guillem, Jaume just pays Guillem directly. So Pera, in this case, sold cloth and received furs, apparently without he himself having had to receive payment or pay in coin. So these kinds of transitive payments can be found commonly in the notarial registers from Puigcerdà in this period. Thus, I want to emphasize that we cannot necessarily assume that monetary payments were always satisfied with coin. It is possible that payments and debts which were recorded in money were actually eventually paid in items or in services that the recipient judged to be equal to the value of the money that was owed. Now, that said, if payment in kind or in services was a widespread practice in medieval Puigcerdà, it was one which primarily occurred outside of the scope of written records, and which has left us little trace. Payment in kind or in services was common only in two contexts: the payment of wages and the payment of debts of cloth dyers. Outside of these two contexts, there are almost no clear examples of someone paying in kind or in services. Acts that are structured as debts of items are very common. So among the 7,821 surviving notarial acts from the year 1321 to 22, there are 936 debts that are due in kind. And these include things for livestock, cereals, salt, wine, lumber, and above all, wool. In fact, the majority of them are for wool in this sort of Pyrenean region. But the vast majority of these debts of items, over 98% of them, appear to be advance sales. So these are situations in which a buyer has purchased a good and paid up front for it, but they will not receive it until a later time. They're not cases in which a debtor wanted to pay their own debt in kind. There were also 12 loans that were due in kind and 34 quittances acknowledging the receipt of an item, usually for sort of the custodial transfer of something, not, again, payment in kind. But if we look at this collection of records, very few suggest true cases of payment in kind, and of those that do, they're mostly for the payment of wages. I'm not going to go into detail about the specific cases, but they're in the paper if you want to look at that. There was one example, which I discuss in the paper, in which a man released his family from owing him a share of their estate by accepting as his inheritance portion wheat to be paid out over the course of 6 years. And this is probably a case in which the family did not have sufficient resources or liquidity to pay him in cash. So this does appear to be a case of payment in kind, but this is the only case of non-wage payment in kind that I could find in this year. Payment in kind can also be seen among the many apprenticeship and labor contracts from this year, suggesting that items and other forms of care were commonly used as remuneration, as was training in the case of apprentices. And this is similar to what we've seen in a number of the papers that we've been hearing this week. So there are a total of 129 surviving apprenticeship and wage labor agreements from this year. 75, or 58% of them, include some manner of remuneration in kind, not including training, but in some combination of food, drink, clothing, and shoes. Except in one case, which is a wet nurse, or when some cash specifically replaces the provision of clothing, payment in kind for these basic necessities often serves as the only remuneration for laborers who receive it. So this shows that these in-kind payments were a significant portion, sometimes the total remuneration, for those workers. So in over half of these employment agreements, the worker's salary was paid largely or entirely in kind. So, in sum, it was not uncommon for laborers to receive wages or salary partly or wholly in kind, but it was apparently uncommon, according to the records, outside of the context of wages, for debts to be paid in kind. Payment in services was more common than payment in kind, but it was limited, as I said, to only one industry, cloth dyeing. In Puigcerdà in the early 14th century, cloth dyers regularly arranged to pay their own debts with promises to dye cloth. So in a typical example from 1322, a cloth dyer named Bernat Maurot acknowledged owing a cloth finisher named Bernat Tamir 55 shillings probably of Barcelona, for linen cloth, and to pay this debt, he promised to dye cloth with good colors whenever his creditor wished. And I've put that up here so you can see it. I mentioned earlier that debts of items appear very commonly in the surviving notarial registers, but they primarily appear to be advance sales, not payment in kind. The opposite is true for payment in cloth dyeing. So from the year 1321 to 22, cloth dyers appear in a total of 28 acts in which they promise to dye cloth, and of these 28, 7 are structured as advance sales of cloth dyeing. The remaining 21 appear to be cases like this example here, in which the cloth dyer owes a creditor for some reason and arranges to pay their debt by dyeing cloth. Cloth dyers paid for a wide variety of different types of debts by promising to dye cloth. So in this year, 12 times the debts were for items purchased on credit, including cloth, livestock, wool, pasture. 3 times they were for loans. Twice they were for the combination or refinancing of previous debts. And amazingly, cloth dyers often paid for real estate, even relatively expensive real estate transactions, by promising to dye cloth. There were at least 6 cases from this year for the purchase of houses, fields, a garden, and 1 long-term lease. In all these cases, the cloth dyers promised to pay the debts for the land by dyeing cloth. These are not cases of barter in the sense of direct exchange. The debts are clearly monetized. Values owed are stated in sums of money, but the form of payment is the service of dyeing cloth. At times, the cloth dyers are specific about exactly how many and what types of cloth will be dyed, and in what colors. Dyeing cloth specific colors had a monetary value, and acts sometimes specifically state the price associated with different colors. So for example, a cloth dyer might promise to dye cloth blue for 11 shillings and to dye cloth red or green for 16 shillings. At other times, the dyers simply promise to dye the cloth at whatever the going rate in use in Puigcerdà is when the creditor requests it. So the dyeing of cloth functions in this way as an alternative currency. Cloth dyers don't always promise to pay their debts by dyeing cloth. So in this year, 1321 to 22, cloth dyers from Puigcerdà appear in 45 other acknowledgements of debts, in which they state their debt only in monetary value. Interestingly, the cloth dyers always promised payment in money in the 16 cases in which they purchased dye stuffs, so dyes like woad and madder and the dye fixative alum. This suggests that the ability for cloth dyers to pay in the service of cloth dyeing depends on the willingness of their creditor to accept payment in that form, and that sellers of dye stuffs, who naturally sold to many different cloth dyers, were not interested in accepting payment in this form. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, a promise of payment in money does not necessarily mean that the payment eventually delivered will be in coin. Debts can be refinanced with the mode of payment changing. Debts can also be transferred to new creditors who may prefer payment in a form that is different than the payment the original creditor preferred. So for example, if we go back to this example that I showed before, in which this debt was transferred multiple times before it was finally recovered, the original debtor in this case, Berenguer, is a cloth dyer. And it is possible that the reason the debt had to be transferred multiple times is that it had to be transferred until it found a creditor who was willing to accept payment in the form of cloth dyeing. It's speculation. We don't know in this case, but it's possible. Going back to this slide, we can say that cloth dyers promise to pay their debts in cloth dyeing at least about 1/3 of the time, and possibly higher, and this is a high and significant percentage. No other industry in medieval Puigcerdà made any regular use of payment in services in the written records. Payment in services was thus specific and particular to the cloth dyeing industry in this town during this period. Its use cannot be a symptom of, for example, a lack of coinage. Coinage was evidently in sufficiently high supply that most transactions were recorded in only monetary sums. So a fundamental question remains, why was payment in services so prominent within the cloth dyeing industry when it was otherwise rare? The cloth dyeing industry's use of payment in services most likely derives from the specific circumstances affecting the development of this industry in this period, and above all from the practices developed by the merchants who sold the primary materials needed for cloth dyeing. The cloth industry in Puigcerdà grew very rapidly beginning in the last decades of the 13th century. By the early 14th century, the town was dominated by the production of woolen cloth for export. To satisfy high and growing demand for dyed cloth, cloth dyers needed to import dyes like woad, madder, and alum. These were initially imported from Occitan merchants, mainly from Narbonne and Limoux, but then beginning in the first years of the 14th century, from Tuscan merchants, first from Arezzo and then from Florence. Both the Occitan and Italian merchants who supplied dyestuffs to the cloth dyers of Puigcerdà made frequent use of transitive debt repayments, in which the end recipient of dyed cloth pays back not the cloth dyer, but the merchant who sold dyestuffs to the cloth dyer. This was done by Occitan merchants, but it becomes even more common when the Tuscan merchants take over this trade. So, for example, in the year 1309 to 1310 alone, a single Italian merchant, Lando Bruno of Arezzo, appears in a total of 126 sales on credit of various dyestuffs, and over 90% of them were transitive debts in which his own customers' customers promised to pay him back on account of their cloth dyer's debt to him. And this was not exclusive to Puigcerdà. This same phenomenon has also been seen in the Catalan area of Empúries, and in fact, Catherine Vernat showed us a later example of a payment in dyed cloth from Vallespir yesterday, Vallespir is in the same sort of Catalan Pyrenean region, and this may have had the same ultimate origin. It's not entirely clear which side of the transaction preferred or requested the system of transitive debts that led to more widespread payment in cloth dyeing. It is possible that this was the dyestuff merchants who, more experienced with long-distance trade and with the financial techniques developed to facilitate it, preferred to place themselves as the financial master of these multiple credit transactions and in a position to profit from any possible hidden interest charged on these multiple credit transactions. It is also possible that cloth dyers had limited resources or little liquidity with which to purchase expensive imported raw materials, but wanting to take advantage of rapid market growth, found it convenient to direct their customers to pay back their own creditors. And it's also possible that both factors are simultaneously at play. In any case, the fact that cloth dyers frequently pay in cloth dyeing is clearly connected to the circumstances affecting this industry around the turn of the 14th century. So finally, to conclude, this case suggests that payment in services are more closely connected to longer distance trade and more sophisticated commercial techniques, should not be considered a backwards or underdeveloped system of exchange. Thank you.
Mille grazie Elisabeth. Allora passiamo alla domanda.
Okay, let's start now the Q&A session. First and foremost for Alexandra and Lluís. Please, you can read the forms that the attendants have previously filled in to ask you questions.
Sì. la plus populaire. Vous n'avez pas aucune demande. Non, non, non. Aspettiamo Lluís. Lluís? Sono molti.
We have a lot of questions. We ask you to be short and to speak slow. Can you please try and speak slow? Thank you. Slow speaking, please. First for Lluís Sales.
Is goed, dank je. Well, first, thank you.
Grazie mille, grazie a tutti per le vostre brillanti presentazioni. La prima domanda è per Alexandra e Lluís. Quando hai parlato del tuo caso, ne abbiamo parlato anche durante l'intera conferenza, mi chiedeva...
In your examples that actually influence the development of markets for wax and for candles. You have these huge players in the market taking huge amount of commodities. You know, in your case, it's wax and candles, could be anything else. What does this do for the market? For other smaller players that need to buy, sell? So perhaps for later on, for the discussion for the roundtable, it might be interesting to think about what is the effect of non-monetary transactions in the formation of markets. Thank you.
William Caferra.
My question was a lot like the previous one, but I have a comment and two questions. One, for those who've looked at the chronicles of Italy, you find that funerals are often described by the number of candles there are, so it's striking, you know, and just to say, but when you talk about circular economy, I wondered, in the spirit of the previous question, just how robust that market is. It sounded, there would seem to be a disconnect between England and the evidence you have for Italy, which is far more profound, far more developed. It more seemed internal, and I wondered how broad that market was. Also, I wanted to just ask about the notion of a moral economy. For those of us in the American Academy, we think of E.P. Thompson and we think of kind of a secular moral economy, and you're talking about religious institutions, so I was just a bit confused.
Marian Kowalewski.
My question is about the poor man's wax, tallow, another animal product that has its own ecology. And obviously wax is higher status, it doesn't smell, in all ecclesiastical institutions and anybody of any rank. But when you're looking at peasants or poor urban people, they are investing in tallow. So in a place like London, you have 2 separate guilds of tallow chandlers, which implies that there is a very large market for that type of candle. So I was wondering if you know anything or can say anything about these 2 very similar products that have different symbolic meaning, but do the same thing.
Yes, potete rispondere.
Okay. All right. Well, sorry. Yes? Is it working? Okay. Thank you for these challenging questions that I wish I had more time to think about, but we're on the spot, so we'll have a go. Okay, so it's a really good question about what the overall impact is on the market more broadly. And I think that we see 2 sort of different things happening that probably depend on the type of institution. So we have, for example, like very large institutions which can have one chandler who provides all of the wax. Like all of the wax for Westminster Abbey is provided by one chandler. But we have other institutions where they have lots of chandlers, and we have to also remember all of the like parish churches and all of the other kinds of smaller, more local or private institutions that have multiple chandlers or one smaller chandler or even a local parishioner who keeps bees and then collects like the wax from around the region. So there's room for those. But one thing that is interesting is that I would have expected, but that we don't find, is that I would have expected that if you are buying lots of wax from one chandler, that you would be getting a preferential rate for that wax. And that people who have to buy like little bits here and there would be having to pay more. And that we don't see a direct correlation in that way. So it's not, there's obviously other things that are sort of mediating those relationships that aren't just purely based on like volume or even stability of purchase. So there's certainly room for those small players. And I think that we encounter kind of a problem that we have with, well, lots of aspects of like the medieval economy, that sort of the smaller you are, the harder you are to see. In the accounts as well, so I think there's also a selection bias that we're seeing. But when we look at smaller institutions, we can certainly see that there is room for those people. How, in terms of the total volume, is certainly something more to think about. Does that answer or begin to answer your question? No, but okay. You're too polite to say in public.
In relation to the second question, which I think is closely related to this first one, you felt that there was no. Sorry. There was a certain disconnection between the 2 cases, and I think it is true, but it's not to a certain point due to the the regional differences, but to the scale differences and the size differences of the institutions analyzed here. We have studied other cases, such as especially 3 cathedrals in Iberia, well, one in Mallorca, and the Cathedral of Toledo, and the Cathedral of Barcelona. We have studied these 3 cases, and the functioning system of wax recycling and wax reselling resemble a lot in terms not only of amount, but of relationship with the different economic actors, the one of Or San Michele. So we assume that this was a system, the one that we have explained for Or San Michele, that was generally put in place in institutions large enough to put in motion this scheme of wax recycling and wax reusing. And in relation to that, to the concept of this, perhaps was more of a provocation, moral economy of wax. Well, it is true that we see in certain spaces a lowering of the prices of the wax offered by these institutions than the prices we'd find in the free market. For instance, I have assessed this for the case of Barcelona, looking at a really tiny small hospital, a leper's hospital, which cannot afford all this gigantic scheme of wax recycling and has to access to the free market annually, and the prices they are paying for the wax are much higher than the prices you'd find, for instance, the Cathedral of Barcelona in that same period, late 1390s, for instance. So yeah, there is a difference, and that has an impact on the wax they at the same time sell to their parishioners. So when I try to provoke you with that notion of moral economy of wax, I'm referring to that, to the ability of certain very large institutions such as cathedrals, such as Or San Michele, to provide wax at a lower price. To whom? To their... Sometimes. Yeah, I know. I was trying to nuance this. But to whom? To their own parishioners. I mean, people could generally not access the free market of wax in such a lower prices, but in general, for instance, I've recently studied this for the case of Mallorca. It's only the parishioners, the people that live around the cathedral, that would have access to this very low price or lower price wax. And as we were saying in the paper, there's also a second fact, a second element, which is simply the disposal of wax from these big institutions to the poorest of their community. And we see this especially in funerals. Almost no one was buried without a single candle. Even the most poor could have, at free cost, gratia amore, normally some amount of candles. And finally, in relation to the tallow candle thing, tallow candle difference, in our full paper we have discussed, and actually in a footnote, the price difference between tallow and candle, which is something like 1 to 5 approximately. And for instance, in Barcelona, we know well that there were also 2 different guilds. The tallow chandler guild belonged to the butchers. They were somehow attached to the butchers, while the chandlers, the beeswax chandlers, were considered artists, and they were certainly very different. They had different bylaws and different regulations. In general, it is true that liturgy needs beeswax. This has been prescribed since the actually early 12th century. But it is true that inside the same temples, inside the same Christian temples, you have the illumination of the naves, for instance, in tallow candles, because it's simply much more cheap than beeswax. While for domestic illumination, except for the very higher strata, in general, you'd find also tallow candles. I don't know if you want to add something in, relation to the difference between talent and beeswax?
I would just say that Marianne says that they do the same thing, and I think we would say, but do they do the same thing? I mean, in that they both illuminate, but they don't perform the same function. Outside of like a domestic lighting sphere, but even then, they're signifiers of social sort of status. So absolutely, so we see in the same accounts wax and tallow, but they're not performing like the same function, if you see what I mean.
I would finally add that, if possible, yes, that in specific context of raise of prices of beeswax, for instance, of shortage of wax that mostly comes from the Maghreb, has to be said. We haven't dealt with this here, but most wax consumed both in Italy and the Iberian Peninsula comes during the 14th, 15th, and even 16th century from the Maghreb. Well, in these periods in which there are shortages of wax or very high prices of wax, even the religious institutions come up with alternatives to white wax, which is the one desired and required for the liturgy. And we've seen, for instance, really bad quality candles covered in chalk, in white chalk. Or we've seen, for instance, and I'm remembering a case of a monastery nearby Barcelona. An oil lamp, olive oil lamp that burned, but it was disguised as if it was a candle. And these are all sorts. Okay, I'm going to finish. These are all sorts of alternatives that we see during in these periods, because wax is certainly a very expensive product. Thank you.
Grazie. Per Team Soens, Katia Antunes.
So Tim, feel free to ignore part of my questions, because I have many, and Carlos is just going to shut me up. Do you see, so very quickly, do you see a transition in mentality where definitions of wealth are posited on cereals rather than cash? In this case, in Antwerp rather than in Ghent. The second point is about the correlation between a highly pre-industrialized area of Ghent, where most people earn wages which we would expect being cash, having a very secured lifeline of cereals coming from northern France, regional trade, river trade. We can understand how safe that is, versus a world where you would expect pre-capitalism or capitalism on long-distance trade raising in this period of time, being more insecure. So my question is, when does the tipping point arise, is mostly from the point of view of Antwerp, where long-distance food supply, so not the luxury trades, right, the bulks, when does this shift take place? Long-distance trade is at some point, safer, more regular, cheaper perhaps than this transregional. The last point is about, I think, the commercializing instruments behind the cereal trades. So how is cereal purchased from the staple in Ghent that totally differs from an open market, capitalized, blah, blah, blah market in Antwerp? Does that make a difference for what you're seeing in your sources? And ignore, please, what you cannot answer because of time.
Thank you. Marianne?
Two questions. The first is, you had a very interesting and convincing list of variables to consider. One variable that you did not consider is the force of custom, the force of law, and we wrote a very good paper about that just a few days ago. Were there any examples of customary law giving landlords the kinds of powers that might have affected whether urban landowners chose to invest in that area, or whether they found it easier or harder to extract payments in kind. My second question is comparative. I know a little bit about London. There's a lot of London deeds. They've not been analyzed for the most part, except for the topography of London, one neighborhood in London itself. But in looking at them, you certainly find people investing in land in the countryside. In fact, a lot of the civic elite have come from the countryside, so they own manors, they inherit them, they buy them. Unfortunately, none of their accounts survive, but you do occasionally have terms of their leases. And I have to say, you do not see payments in kind. Now, is that because London markets are more efficient? Is it because they can get these products to Londoners more easily? They have access to these types of supplies, that Londoners didn't need the same kind of insurance against scarcity that people in Antwerp needed? I don't know. Be curious about your assessment.
Robert Braid.
Hi, Tim. Two quick questions, one regarding outsourcing, the other one, the question of the transfer of risk. In terms of outsourcing, when they're receiving grain, they're not just eating the grain, they want to transform it into bread. And it would seem that the poorer households of artisans would not have the staff to do that in their house on there. And the richer households that you mentioned that were receiving the grain, they would have the staff. And I don't know what is the critical mass at which you were able to have the staff to do this to make it economically viable. In the hospital that I have in Marseille, despite the size, the availability of bakers in a smaller city, they just directly buy bread. They don't have a baker, the household staff to transform. So it's the question of outsourcing. At what point do they want to outsource the service or to have it in-house? And the second one is the question of the transfer of risk. The question of the fixity. So when they are receiving a payment of cereal or cash, is it the quantity fixed of cereal, or is it a percentage of what is being produced that is fixed? So in taxes, the 10th, the 15th, it's usually a percentage of what is being imported, exported, or even produced. Or is it, in this case, is it a fixed quantity? If it's a fixed quantity, it's the producer that is taking the risk, because he doesn't know how much he's going to produce from one year to the next. But if it's a fixed percentage, the risk is being transferred to the receiver of the cereal. So if you could give me some elements about that, that would be interesting. Thanks.
Philippe Scofield.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks very much for a very interesting session, everybody. The question I was wondering really was in relation, you used the term moral economy quite a lot, but in a sense, what we're seeing is a immoral economy, or one at least that is very much weighted towards those that seem to be relatively capital rich in that respect. And your example from the early 1480s towards the end of your paper of that sort of core market kind of rule, in a sense, seems to be a very self-interested one. And I wondered whether there was a sort of compensatory mechanisms and a sort of investment in the sort of balance to that. Do you see charitable institutions and other kind of functions that are somehow alleviating some of this movement of grain into the hands of the relatively privileged, as I see it? Thank you.
I just go here. Thank you for the interesting questions to all four commenters. I start by the questions by Katia Antunes. Do we see a shift in in the mentality to which wealth is based on cereals, wealth is based on cash. For most of the private households, their wealth is not based on cereals. Their wealth is based on cash and capital investments. So their wealth is mostly cash in all two. Well, cash or investments and placements of cash. It can be in landed property, but the mass of their income is not in cereals. There are only a few institutions which really have the largest part of their income in cereals. That's that's a small minority. But what I find interesting is that these amounts of cereals are never gigantic, not for the private households. Even rich merchants, they try to have access to a certain quantity of cereals outside the market, which is sufficient. It's 2,000, 4,000 liters. It's not for trading and redistributing, or a bit to some servants perhaps, but not the massive amount. But yeah, it's the idea that you have this access to this quantity of cereals, which certainly allows you to provide your own needs. It's not a matter that these people never had to fear that they couldn't buy cereals on the market. They were rich enough, whatever the price, they would always have been able to buy the cereals. But that doesn't matter. Even in later cases, in Antwerp in the 17th century, the Moretus family, who was at the top of the city's elite, their rye was always delivered by their tenants. And they invested a lot of money to be sure that their rye could come from their tenants. The second question, the industrial Ghent versus the commercializing, the long-distance trade. The grain staple is interesting there. In Ghent you have this grain staple, which it didn't allow to really lower the price. That's not the case. The grain staple also didn't influence the price, but it guaranteed the volume, and it guaranteed that there always was volume of cereals on the market. Because the grain staple, in fact, it's not about price setting, it's about guaranteeing that all grain from in this rich grain trade from the north of France to the Low Countries, that all grain had to pass via the city and had to offer for sale to the city. And that guaranteed the volume on the markets, and that was what mattered. Antwerp would in the 16th century become reliant on its Baltic grain trade supplies, but in the 15th century it's not yet. So the question, of course, is what will happen with these land-based cereal supplies in the 16th century, when there really is an alternative brought by long-distance trade. Will they then stick on to these direct deliveries, or will we see that when there is a sort of more or less secure long-distance trade, will they then abandon that? I'm not sure yet. We're not yet there, but it will be interesting to see. I think that the long-distance trade, it had no impact on the prices at all. The only thing it did was even inflate the prices. So I don't believe that in a medieval economy, long-distance grain trade ever offered a sort of security against famine. On the contrary, the more integrated in the grain markets a region was, the higher the fluctuations of the prices often. So yeah, that's interesting to see. And did I answer everything? Yeah, also, yeah. What Yeah, I leave it there. I go to the questions by Marianne Kowaleski. The comparison with London first, that's interesting because in our, this is part of a comparative project, and we also have a colleague, Kathleen Pribyl, who does not investigate London, but Norwich. Norwich as once the second town. And in Norwich, all leases are also cash, like you see for London. It's never in-kind leases, and in Norwich it's the same. Only the Cathedral Priory, when they lease out their farms, they have some in-kind leases left as a remnant of the mean farming. But the citizens of Norwich, only cash leases there. So it's an interesting, of course the lease is always normative. Does it also reflect what's the actual practice? We don't know. We don't know in Antwerp and Ghent either. But the more detailed the conditions in the leasehold contracts, the more we can think that they reflect, that they mirror the practices also, and the less standardized they are. So it's interesting. On the customary laws, indeed, the laws regarding to leasehold, leasehold it only starts in the 13th century, as the short-term leasehold only spreads in the 13th century, and gradually customary law is getting more standardized, and the rights and obligations of owner and tenant become more fixed by customary law. It's about, I think, what matters is the social relation between the owner and the tenant farmer. So if there is sort of, when you see these in-kind leases, there is always more reciprocity than in it's just the cash leases. You always have the impression that these cash leases are more a sort of market arrangement, and that as soon as in-kind alternative currencies are involved, that there is a sort of a more personal relation. Also the fact that these tenant farmers had to deliver these cereals and other in-kind products to the house of the owner. There are the transport services, so there is a regular contact, there is a sort of, they are in touch, they see each other, and whereas, for instance, in these purely cash leasehold systems, very competitive, a lot more rotation of the tenant farmers also, it does get more anonymous, and I think for instance, the chance for eviction is greater. So the in-kind deliveries they are unequal, they are even more unequal, I come back to that, than the cash deliveries, but at least there is some form of unequal reciprocity, you could say. And in the sort of cash economy, I have the impression that the tenant farmer is less protected and has less, there is less clemency towards a tenant farmer, I guess, but I cannot prove that. And that brings me to the questions of Robert Braid on the risk, because indeed, these are all leases with the quantity fixed. It's not you have some what we call sharecropping contracts and shareholding, where it's a percentage, but here, the large majority is fixed quantity, and indeed the risk goes to the tenant farmer. So the risk goes to the tenant farmer. In times of bad harvests, it's clearly advantageous for the owner. That's absolutely clear. In times of low prices, it's a bit better for the tenant farmer. And then I think that this reciprocity of the larger tenant farmers with the urban households might mitigate a bit this kind of risk. You see on the one hand that the cities in times of food shortage try to force the farmers to fulfill their commitments, so there is an issue. But on the other hand, an urban landlord, and every landlord also has an interest in keeping this long-distance relationships with these larger tenant farmers. So Yeah. On the outsourcing, the system as we see it, institutions have their own bakers, but households, urban households don't bake themselves, but they usually tend to bring it to the baker. And I have one example where you see that the household brings a quantity of cereals to the baker and in return gets a bread credit. So it's noted that in return for this quantity of cereals, I can buy up to this amount of bread from that baker. So this is, I think, how it works. You bring your cereals to the baker and you get a credit to buy bread for the equivalent amount. But we see that when there are stock takings of cereals, you see that small stocks of cereals are widespread in cities like Antwerp. So if you can, you have your own stock of cereals on the attic of your house. And then the last question by Philip Schofield. Thanks for also, the moral economy. It's an immoral economy, you say, and you're right. If you look at town-countryside relationships, is this risk which is shifted to the countryside that's unequal. There is, and also within the city, it guarantees the access to food for those who can in fact, for those who are always able to buy food. So it's what is then the moral economy of it. It's only that you see that they try to keep part of the cereal market out of the highly uncontrollable monetary market of cereals, so that many households try to get an alternative for this regular and highly unpredictable cereal market. And so they value a sort of steady supply of cereals, which is certain, where you have control over. Do they share it with the poor citizens? I have no... there are charitable institutions, of course, but it's not like an Italian city who will redistribute massive amounts of, which I imagine where redistributive systems were more massive. In fact, also in times of famine, there are never bread and grain distributions. So in the Low Countries. So it's. I tend to agree with you that I should very much qualify this idea of a moral economy. It's more about establishing and consolidating inequalities than it's about to guarantee everyone, also the poorer citizens. No, you have the impression, as I said in my conclusion, that the poor have to pay in cash, that the cash economy is something for the poor. They don't get credit, they don't have alternative resources. They will only get commodities if they pay for them in cash. So that's, we are far from the moral economy in that respect. Thank you.
Pour Julie Claus, Robert Braid.
Juste deux petites questions de précision. Je ne suis pas sûr d'avoir complètement compris. Lorsque
Okay, I'd like to point out something. I'm not sure I understood. Okay, the tailor would be paying the master? Is it just a service? And is it the master providing the raw material, asking for some specific production? Or is it the tailor presenting the finished product? And the second question deals with the craft or the profession as a tailor. Besides, if I understood properly, They were being paid with services, and the clients are providing, the customers are providing the raw material. And then, if anything is left, the so-called leftovers, or the left, is it part of the payment? Does the tailor preserve this material? Is it preserved in a secular economy, for example? It should be sold to other customers.
Pour ces questions, alors le métier de couturier à Paris comme...
Okay, as for the profession of a tailor in Paris, is a job. So tailors are not selling raw materials. Usually they don't sell it. They didn't sell it because, with some exceptions, therefore customers came with the cloth, with the fur, with the clothing for them, for some lining, and then so the customer came with the raw material. The tailor would be cutting and stitching the fabric and structuring and preparing the clothing at a rather low price. And what is being paid is these...
Le couturier, éventuellement des chutes de matières premières, il n'y a rien.
The dressmaking cost. And what about what is left? There is nothing.
Or put a dress, a suit.
But they are not justifying this kind of use. But the regulation is rather clear. The raw material belongs to the customer, therefore it has to be returned. The tailor, there is a rather developed technical documentation, and everything is reported, dealing with the object and the raw material.
Ou que le couturier n'abîme pas la matière.
No swindle, to avoid any fraud or swindle by the tailor, and these raw material should not be damaged. Therefore, the customer, therefore working as a tailor and cutting the cloth, they are organized in this way. The cloth dealer, the cloth maker, and the tailor for furs. Something not owing the raw material, but other working with the raw material. Because working as a tailor, they only paid a little tax. This was to be seen in Paris. Therefore, there were tailors of princes and kings integrating this. But most...
La plupart des couturiers...
There are many tailors in Paris, and most of them are tailors with a small shop at a district level. Therefore, they worked with masters from Rive Gauche University.
Sí. Katia Antunes.
So, Elizabeth, thank you again for the paper. And I would like to go back to your points about transient debt, which is something that for early modernists working on trade, we call this thing, different things all the time, depending on the places and the centuries. But I think transient debt might be a concept that we might apply. So I think my first question is that, so how is transient debt, non-monetarized transient debt, enforced? The second question, I think, is about, so zooming out a little bit from your case study, is how does this type of debt, transient debt, non-monetarized debt, being paid back perhaps in non-monetarized terms, affect the costs and the interest rates on the credit and the debt markets? And again, ignore me if I'm overstepping what your sources can say, because I guess what I'm ultimately interested after all, 4 days of discussion, again, perhaps later on for the roundtable, is how do alternative means of payment and alternative currencies actually impact ways in which and patterns of capital accumulation. I mean, do we need to go back to the drawing table and redefine capital? Do we need to rethink how capital is accumulated and how in different centuries? So I don't want to put you on the spot on this last question, but it would be interesting to understand what does transient debt actually do in such a small community in terms of market of credit and debt and means of enforcement.
Maria Kowalewski.
So I'm interested if the situation you describe for dyers paying for dyestuffs, expensive dyestuffs in services could possibly have changed in later 14th century. So the example I'm going to give is from the town of Exeter, which in the early 14th century in Devon probably had about 7,000 people, somewhat similar size. And the dyers were very rich, and they dealt heavily in woad, which was imported from Picardy. There were lots of foreign traders in Exeter, or Exeter was a port as well. And so the cloth that was being produced was largely a dyed cloth. After the Black Death, because of the 100 Years' War, these dyers no longer had access or as easy access to this expensive dye stuff because of the 100 Years' War, but also because the production of cloth had begun to change in Devon. And they had moved to a cheaper product that was often undyed and often meant for export as well. So these two factors led to a decline in the numbers and the status of dyers. Now, I've studied lots of debts in this area, and it's heavily monetized. Because they have, I analyzed 4,000 plus debts in just one 10-year period and never saw payments in kind. But I acknowledge that the monetary sums that were being named in the court rolls could actually have hidden payments in kind. What I'm more interested in is that kind of shift that I saw in Exeter. Could that have happened in your town, and then would that have affected payments in kind? Because the dye stuffs that replaced them were cheaper and there were many fewer of them. They didn't need to pay for their debts that way.
Cécile?
I guess my question is very close to Katja's in some respects. As this conference has proceeded, I've been increasingly troubled by the suspicion that we've all been talking not so much about alternatives to money or alternative currencies, which have a kind of institutional, broader impact in and of themselves, than we have talked about the ways in which in specific kinds of exchanges, commodities or services of one sort or another function in specific circumstances and with specific groups or individuals. And that brings me to my question, which also has to do with the transfer of debt or transitive debts. Today we talk about the assignment of debt, and that's the specific term that's used in finance. And it's not a semantic difference because it talks about the ways in which a creditor in a sovereign act, nobody can force him or her, transfers not only the debt, but the rights that obtain in that debt as well to a third party. And so one of my questions is, what can you tell us, this is very close to Katja's question, what can you tell us about the legal context of debt enforcement in this particular town and in this particular circumstance? Now today and in the past, the transfer or the assignment of a debt is often accompanied by discounting. You know, the creditor and the third party also recognize the possibility that the costs and risks of collecting the debt may make it not worthwhile, and that's why the whole thing takes place to begin with. So my second question is, if in fact the debt, the payment of the debt is somehow shifted from a payment in money to a payment in labor, does that shift constitute a discount? And then my third question, related to the whole business, finally, is what's the actual currency if such a thing exists here? Is it the labor or is it the debt itself? Thank you.
Francine Michaud.
My question is very, very short, and it tags along the last question that Miriam asked you, Elizabeth. It's about the socioeconomic integration, or at least representation, their social play, the dyers in your community in that time period. That's it. Thanks.
Se vi sembra bene, Elisabeth.
I also submitted a question. I have also submitted a question.
Sì, no. Ci sono molte domande e risponderà.
There are too many questions.
It's connected to the others, so I think it will be better. Yeah, so is mine.
Vale. Well, Daniel Starr.
I just want to continue what Katja and Tom said. I think that by now it's clear there is no linear development into currency, and I think that's it. But what I found important also is to start to conceptualize and to look about the interplay of those different forms of currency. And in this case, I'm wondering, how does the Gresham or Copernicus law come into play here? So whether it was not better to use this assignment of credit instead of paying in cash and saving cash for storing value. So how did, when all those were possible means of payment, when did one prefer one against the other? We saw inflation in the case of 18th century France, but I think here we might have different answers. Thank you.
Alexandra Irigoyen.
Okay. Well, a bit more of the same, but thank you, Elizabeth, for the paper. Quickly, because it would be a little bit of a repetition, but looking at it in a different way. I come from a most liquid economy of the early modern period, so discount that. But I would like to know a little bit the effect of these Tuscans enablers or financiers of the dying. So I was wondering if you have seen any changes in the scale or the prices of this jobs commission. And am I very old reading? It seems to be a little bit like a putting out system, so I wouldn't probably call this services, but labor. And building on what other colleagues said, I would like to know, how prices were set. If there are advances of dyes or capital or input, how do they fix or establish the future price of these goods? If this is a matter of liquidity in an economy that is chronically short of cash, how is the demand for cash working here? And that brings me to the question of the trenching debt and the possibility of discounting or a discount in this transfer of debts. Could you find any way to trace? I know there are very few cases you have, but can you find any trace of changes in the relative prices of whichever service or labor is traded there as to estimate, the effect of having liquidity or lacking liquidity, or in other words, the demand for cash? But I guess that is very much the sense of the other questions. Thank you anyway. I learned a lot from your paper.
Robert Ray.
Yes, very related to the previous questions relative to debt. I'm very surprised that when there's a transfer of debt, it's exactly the same value. Today, there are bond markets, and every time debt is transferred, the value is renegotiated. So there's that question. And it's also a question relative to today's bond markets. Are there installments to pay the debt, or are all of these debt contracts one lump sum paid at some defined end? Or are there debt contracts in which you should pay 1/3 here and 1/3 there and 1/3 there? Because in the labor contracts, which are a form of debt as well, there are installments. They get a portion of that back at different installments. So that was my question.
Philippe?
Thank you. It's very much on the same theme, so I'll just try to change it a little bit. And this is a question I think that I'd really like to hear Julie answer as well, in the sense if there was space, because such an excellent paper with the same sorts of issues about the relationship between debt in goods and kind and money and the underlying nuances of that. We've heard about assignment, and we've heard about some of those difficult issues about what credit constitutes in this context. And is it acting as velocity? Is it acting as M, as money? And can we detect certain nuances? So where we've got really quite stable prices, as in your vêtements example, and also in what we're seeing in terms of the dyestuffs with Elizabeth's paper, are there still subtleties that are re-establishing that relationship with the money that underpins it? Or is that relationship, in terms of vêtements or in terms of dyestuffs, effectively replacing money in those contexts?
C'était la dernière question donc, pour répondre à Philippe Schofield et à...
Answering Philippe. I would like to provide a very quick interpretation, because we have 14 transactions with payments in kind, and the peculiar relationship between the tailor and the master. I would like to provide an interpretation for all payments in money, more than 60, and then we could have important results. But I didn't have such a detailed interpretation. So we can intertwine sources with the documents, allowing us to know customers better and to know, for example, who and what, and the background of parts of the customers. And then going into depth, understanding the ethnographic distribution and the background of each single customer and the transactions intertwining. Therefore, understanding the multidimensional character of such transactions. I didn't do that for transactions in cash. There are over 60, but we should be focusing on the single invoices. I think that the contingency is more difficult to set with this kind of transaction.
So, thank you for your numerous and wonderful and challenging questions. I hope I will be able to address everything that you have raised. So I'm going to start with some that are a little bit less connected because there were quite a few that were sort of on an interrelated theme. So I'm going to start with Marianne's question about whether this situation would have or could have changed in the later 14th century. So it certainly did change, although I don't believe it would have changed in the same way that you have seen in Exeter. So initially, I believe that the dyers are importing Tuscan woad that is produced near Arezzo, first through Occitan merchants and then directly from Tuscan merchants. But later, in Catalonia, they begin to grow woad in the Empúries region. That's been documented in the work of Christian Guillier and Anthony Pinto, and they also begin importing woad from the Toulouse region, where it's also grown there. So that's obviously, I haven't looked directly at the evidence into the 1380s and so on, but I know that they start having access to other woad markets, which is going to change the prices and the whole enterprise. Obviously also, the position of Puigcerdà as a town rapidly diminishes in the second half of the 14th century, which changes its entire economy, so that would impact this as well. And to answer Marianne's last question, it would certainly affect the use of payment in kind, within this context. Secondly, I'm going to answer Francine's question about the social place of dyers. From what I can tell, dyers are sort of in the upper middle segment of the society. They are not typically as wealthy as cloth finishers or drapers or cloth merchants, who tend to be much wealthier and who dominate to a much greater extent the positions in the town government, who, they own more land, they have higher dowries when they marry, etc. But the dyers are certainly better off than some segments of the society. They appear very regularly in notarial acts, which is a sign of having business to participate in, and so on. Did I answer your question? Okay, great. Okay, let me see what else I have here. So, okay, so to go now to Katya's question, this question of how is transitive debt enforced, and also to pull from Tom Safley's question about hold on, looking through my notes, maybe I have that wrong. Who asked about the legal context? Yeah, okay, it was, okay. Okay, so unfortunately, for the specific area of Sardinia where Puigcerdà is located, all of the court records, as far as I'm able to tell, are lost. So we don't have the actual records that allow us to make a deep investigation into the enforcement and the court in this particular area. But there would have been a local jurisdictional court to address any complaints of people who did not pay their debts. And I somewhat want to pass off this question because we have an expert on Catalan local jurisdictional courts on this very panel with Lluís, who has studied this kind of thing in a different region of Catalonia, so may be able to give you a more in-depth question about, or answer about that.
That's a silent of
What? But there is a local court system in which anyone with a complaint against somebody else can go, if that addresses that. Okay, 1 second. So I'm going to now go to Katja's question of how does the type of debt affect the cost and the interest rates? I don't know. This is not in the sources because unfortunately, most of the time, they do not give any indication of interest. I assume that it is likely that many credit transactions included an interest component, but it is never stated. So in fact, we also don't know, this goes to another question that was asked about prices and changing prices over time. I do not know the prices they actually pay when they buy dyestuffs, because the way the contracts are recorded, they say, I owe you this amount of money on account of having bought this thing, but they don't say what the total price for the item is, they don't say the volume that was acquired, they don't say the amount that was put down versus the amount that was financed, and they don't say the terms of the financing, or at what rate of interest the length of financing may be incurring extra costs. So I can't speak to that, but it's a very important and interesting question that obviously plays into this immensely. Okay, let's see. Okay, I'm going to speak now to Robert's question about, so Robert, you expressed surprise that you can have transitive debt for debts of exactly the same value. So I think that this will be a good means for me to speak a little bit more about these sort of transitive debt repayments. It is not necessarily the case that every time the debts are of equal value. So as I mentioned, and in the paper, I spoke at greater length about this, there's two ways that we see this kind of phenomenon. So one is that it appears in one single notarial entry in which they merge the two and the second debtor pays back the original creditor. It's not even clear to me that they make that decision to do that at the moment, that it may not be that all parties are there in front of the notary at the moment making that decision. It could be that one contract has been made and written in a notarial register, and at some later time this is added and then the original one is canceled. So those ones are a little bit less clear. But I know that in the cases when a debt is specifically bought, sold, or transferred, debts can also be inherited. So there's a number of ways in which they can be moved from one party to another. They specifically transfer the parchment copy of the notarial act. The physical object of the record has an important meaning significance that has to be conveyed when the debt is transferred. So they're very careful to note that the parchment has been handed over, and when the debt is finally repaid, they rip the parchment in half to signify that the debt no longer has any value. And we often see that they sometimes only sell or assign a portion of a debt. So sometimes someone buys out the entirety of a debt that somebody else owes, but sometimes they only sell off a piece. And actually, in the case that I had mentioned, where the man had to pay back his mother's dowry, the debt he transfers for the garden does not equal the value that the dowry is worth. So he's only partially fulfilling the debt of the dowry by transferring the garden debt. He still then owes more on top after. There are often installments in the payment of debts. It's very common to see payments dispersed throughout the year in 3 or 4 pieces. But for most of these types of transactions, the sale of dyestuffs, there's one payment due date that is set. Okay, so as to all of these other questions about what is credit, what is the relationship of credit to money, what is the relationship of credit and money to value and to payment in kind and in services. This is really the fundamental issue that I've been grappling with as I've been working on this project. And I was a bit surprised that we didn't see more of the papers in the course of this week, addressing the role of credit in this, facilitating these kinds of exchanges. And I think that there's a lot more work and thinking that I certainly want to do on this issue. So I'm not sure that I actually have all the answers to these excellent questions that have been raised, but I hope that we will have many more conversations on this theme. Okay, are there any of the questions I have not answered? All right, thank you.
Grazie a tutti. Chiudo. Ci sono più domande?
Any more questions from the audience? No question. Wow. So we stop here. Thank you all for your participation, for your attendance, for this incredible presentation, for a direct continuous flow of the question. Please, our work deserves a huge clap of hands. Thank you. We will reconvene after lunch break. Thank you.